Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah. 4 states, 1 point. You can crouch down and touch all of them at once. But what most people standing at that monument never realize is just how strange, contested, and historically loaded that single spot actually is. We are counting down 10 geographic oddities at the Four Corners Monument, and we are starting with the ground beneath your feet. Not the marker, not the states. The actual earth you are standing on sits on top of something much bigger. At number 10, we have the Colorado Plateau. This is one of the most geologically unusual regions in North America. A massive elevated landmass covered in mesas, ancient rock, and deep canyon systems that took hundreds of millions of years to form. The plateau sits at a high elevation, and that elevation does something most visitors never think about. It directly affects weather far beyond the Southwest. Weather systems that build and stabilize over this plateau tend to push eastward through Colorado and into the central United States. That means snowfall in Kansas, rainfall in Missouri. Shifting weather patterns across a huge stretch of the country can trace part of their origin to this remote stretch of desert. The driest, most barren corner of the country is helping shape weather hundreds of miles away. The plateau also acts as a kind of geographic anchor for everything that surrounds the Four Corners. The canyons, the mesas, the dry washes all exist because of how this elevated landmass has resisted erosion differently across its layers over deep time. So when you stand at that marker, you are not just at a political boundary. You are standing on one of the oldest, most intact elevated rock formations on the continent, a landscape that has been shaping climate and geography across the American West for ages. Most visitors read the sign, take the photo, and move on. Almost none of them stop to consider that the ground under their knees is part of a geologic structure vast enough to influence the weather in states they drove through to get there. Coming in at number 9 is Arizona, and Arizona's corner is more interesting than it first appears. The state occupies the southwest quadrant of the monument, but the geography it brings to this meeting point is some of the most extreme on the entire continent. Arizona is home to the Grand Canyon and the Sonoran Desert, 2 of the most recognized natural features in the world. But Arizona's slice of the Four Corners sits in the northeastern corner of the state, which feels completely different from those southern lowlands. The Northeast is higher, cooler, and dominated by the Colorado Plateau geology we just talked about. It is arid and rugged, but in a way that is distinctly different from the saguaro-dotted desert most people picture when they think of Arizona. The monument itself is formally addressed in Ticnos Post, Arizona. That is the postal address of the Four Corners Monument. Ticnos Post is a small Navajo community, and the monument sits on Arizona's portion of Navajo Nation land. That detail matters more than it might seem. The entire monument, all of it, sits on Navajo Nation's sovereign land. Arizona does not own the monument. Neither do any of the other 3 states. The land belongs to the Navajo people, and we will get back to that. But the Arizona angle here is that the state's northeastern corner is essentially a gateway into one of the most politically and geographically layered pieces of land in the country. And most visitors just see it as the state where the gas station is before the drive out. At number 8 is New Mexico. And New Mexico's corner carries a legal history that most people have no idea about. The southeast quadrant looks like flat, unremarkable desert scrub. But in 1919, this corner was at the center of a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court. New Mexico sued Colorado over a disputed portion of the shared border. The argument came down to whether the physical markers placed by 19th century surveyors were the actual legal boundaries, or whether the mathematically precise lines of latitude and longitude should override them. In 1925, the Supreme Court ruled. It affirmed that the original survey markers placed in the field were the legal state boundaries, even when those markers sat slightly off from the mathematically intended coordinates Congress had originally specified. That ruling is still the authoritative legal decision on this matter. It permanently settled where the Four Corners Point legally sits, and it set a precedent in American surveying law that would apply to the Four Corners Monument specifically, in a way we will get to at number 1. New Mexico's corner looks like nothing, a flat patch of scrubland with a state line running through it. But that patch of scrubland was the legal battleground that determined how all of American boundary law treats the relationship between physical markers and mathematical precision. At number 7 is Utah, occupying the northwest quadrant. And Utah brings a layered geographic reality that most visitors completely overlook. 3 of the 4 quadrants at the monument fall within the Navajo Nation. Utah is one of those 3. But Utah also borders the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe Reservation on the Colorado side of the monument. So visitors entering from Utah are, in a single step, crossing from a U.S. state into sovereign Navajo Nation territory. 2 governments, 1 footstep. Utah's Enabling Act was passed in 1894, formally defining its southeastern corner at this exact intersection. Utah was admitted to the Union in 1896, making it one of the final pieces of the legal framework that turned this geographic point into the 4 corners we know today. Before Utah's admission, the intersection was defined but incomplete in a governmental sense. Utah's statehood finalized the quadrupoint as a 4-state meeting, which means the 4 Corners Monument, as a functional legal reality, is younger than most people assume. Utah's corner is also geographically significant because it connects the Colorado Plateau geology of the monument directly into the canyon country that Utah is famous for further north. The same ancient rock layers run continuously from the monument up through Zion, Bryce, and Canyonlands. So Utah's quadrant at the monument is not just a legal corner. It is a geographic doorway into one of the most spectacular stretches of canyon terrain on the planet, and the rock under that corner is the same rock that carved all of it. At number 6 is Colorado, the northeast quadrant, and Colorado holds a distinction that surprises almost everyone who hears it. It is the only quadrant at the 4 Corners Monument where the land falls within the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe Reservation rather than the Navajo Nation. Think about what that means. The Navajo Nation manages and maintains the monument itself, but when you step into Colorado's corner, you are technically standing on Ute Mountain Ute tribal land, not Navajo land. 2 sovereign tribal nations, converging at one point along with 4 states. Colorado's territorial boundaries were established in 1861, among the earliest of the straight-line borders that would eventually create this intersection. Those geometric lines were a new way of drawing borders, replacing river boundaries and mountain ridges with pure math and survey work. The southern border of Colorado runs along the 37th parallel north. That line is one of the 2 that cross at the monument's center. The other runs along the 109th meridian west, roughly speaking, and together they form the crosshairs of one of the most unusual political points in America. Colorado gets less attention at the 4 Corners than Arizona, which has the Grand Canyon, or New Mexico, which had the lawsuit. But Colorado's corner is where the Ute Mountain Ute land begins, and that tribal presence adds a dimension to the monument that most people never register. At number 5 is the Navajo Nation, and this is where the story of the 4 Corners Monument changes completely. Most people think of this as a state line attraction. It is not. The monument sits entirely on sovereign Navajo Nation land, managed as a tribal park. The Navajo Nation is the largest Native American reservation in the United States, covering more than 27,000 square miles across parts of Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. The 4 Corners Monument sits roughly at the center of that vast territory. For the Navajo people, the state boundaries that create the famous quadrupoint are relatively recent political lines, drawn in Washington by people who had never walked the land. The traditional Navajo homeland was defined by 4 sacred mountains, not by survey meridians and parallels. Diné-Ta, the Navajo homeland, was bounded by Cisnagini to the east, Soldzil to the south, Dukuuzli to the west, and Diben-Sa to the north. These mountains framed a world that existed long before any U.S. government drew lines through it. The monument is managed by the Navajo Nation Parks and Recreation Department. Visitors pay an entrance fee, and that money goes directly to the Navajo Nation. The site includes a vendor market where Navajo and Ute artisans sell handmade jewelry, crafts, and food. So the 4 Corners Monument is not just a quirky photo spot. It is a Navajo tribal park on sovereign land with an economic structure that returns revenue to the community whose homeland this is. The state lines are real, but the ground belongs to the Navajo people. At number 4 is something most visitors never realize, even after standing at the monument for 20 minutes. 4 states meet there, yes, but 6 separate governments actually have jurisdictional boundaries converging at that exact same point. Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah are the 4 everyone knows. But the Navajo Nation and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe also have governmental boundaries converging there. 6 governments, 1 point. This makes the 4 Corners one of the most politically layered spots in the country. State lines are the visible feature, the ones marked on the monument. But the presence of two sovereign tribal governments gives the location a legal and cultural complexity that is almost invisible to a casual visitor taking a photo and moving on. The flags at the monument reflect this. Banners for all 4 states fly there, and so do flags representing both tribal nations and the United States itself. 7 flags for 1 point. That physical detail tells you everything about how complicated this small patch of desert actually is. Most people visit the Four Corners expecting a quirky geography lesson about states. What they are actually standing in is a meeting point of 6 sovereign governments, 2 of which predate every state line by centuries and represent peoples who have lived on this land for thousands of years. At number 3 is the one that genuinely shocks most people. The straight lines forming the Four Corners were drawn as a direct result of the Civil War. These state boundaries were not the product of natural geography. They were the product of wartime politics. In the early 1860s, settlers in the southern part of New Mexico Territory declared their intent to secede from the United States and join the Confederacy. They called their region the Arizona Territory, and they proposed splitting New Mexico along a horizontal east-west line. That east-west split would have given the Confederacy a land corridor stretching from Texas all the way to California and the Pacific coast. That was the plan, a Confederate land bridge across the entire southern width of the continent. Congress responded in 1863 by creating a Union-aligned Arizona Territory with a north-south boundary instead. They used the 32nd meridian west of Washington, D.C. as the dividing line, and that line simply extended the existing boundary between Colorado and Utah southward. That single political decision, made in the middle of a war to block a Confederate land bridge, is the direct reason 4 states meet at a single point today. Without the Civil War pressure, Congress almost certainly would have split New Mexico horizontally. If that had happened, there would be no Four Corners monument. There would just be 2 states meeting along a horizontal line somewhere in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. The quadrupoint only exists because Congress needed to stop the Confederacy from reaching the Pacific. So every time someone crouches down and puts one hand in Arizona and one hand in Utah, they are touching a consequence of the Civil War. The monument is a geography quirk on the surface and a piece of wartime political engineering underneath. At number 2 is the longitude misconception, and this one lingered in public knowledge for a long time. For decades, many people believed the Four Corners monument sits at exactly 109 degrees west longitude. It does not, and the reason why is a genuinely fascinating piece of American geographic history. When surveyor Chandler Robbins placed the original marker in 1875, the United States had not yet adopted the Greenwich prime meridian as its standard reference for longitude. The country used its own reference point called the Washington Meridian. The Washington Meridian ran through the dome of the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. It was the American zero line for longitude before the world standardized on Greenwich, England in the late 19th century. The 1863 Act of Congress that created Arizona Territory specified a boundary at 32 degrees west of Washington. When you translate that into Greenwich-based longitude, you get approximately 109 degrees and 3 minutes west, not a clean 109 degrees. The United States did not officially switch to the Greenwich Standard until 1912. That gap between the Washington Meridian and Greenwich, just over 3 minutes of longitude, is exactly what caused decades of confusion about where the monument was supposed to sit. As recently as 2009, news reports were still claiming the monument had been placed miles away from its intended location. Those reports were wrong. They were comparing Greenwich coordinates to Washington Meridian specifications and treating the difference as an error, which it was not. The surveyor followed the law as written in 1863. The law used Washington Meridian coordinates. The marker went exactly where the law said it should go. The confusion came from people applying a 20th century measurement standard to a 19th century legal document. This misconception got enough traction that it became a semi-regular story in American media. It sounds compelling on the surface. The Four Corners monument is in the wrong place. Except it was not. It was in exactly the right place for the law that created it. At number 1 is the greatest geographic oddity of the entire monument. The one that wraps up everything we have talked about and lands in a place that is genuinely strange. The marker is not at the mathematically precise intersection of the lines Congress intended, and it is still legally correct. The original 19th century surveys were done with instruments far less precise than modern GPS. Across vast stretches of remote desert terrain, small measurement errors built up over distance. The surveyors were skilled, but the tools had limits. The U.S. National Geodetic Survey determined that the monument sits approximately 1,800 feet east of where the precise intended coordinates would mathematically intersect based on modern measurement. 1,800 feet, more than a third of a mile off from mathematical precision. That sounds like an error, and in a purely mathematical sense it is, but in the legal sense, it is not an error at all. It is the legally correct location of the Four Corners boundary, and the reason comes back to the Supreme Court ruling we mentioned at number 8. When New Mexico sued Colorado in 1925, the Supreme Court affirmed a foundational principle of American surveying law. The physical marker placed in the field is the legal boundary, not where mathematics says the marker should have gone, where the marker actually is. In boundary law, the monument controls, not the math. That principle was established long before GPS, long before satellite imaging, long before any of the precision tools we now take for granted, and it was established specifically with situations like this one in mind. All 4 states accepted the original survey markers as their official borders. The Four Corners Monument has stood as the legally recognized quadrupoint ever since the original placement. No state has a legal claim to move it. No court has ordered it relocated. The 800-foot discrepancy from mathematical precision is, under U.S. law, completely irrelevant. The marker is the boundary. That is the rule. And that rule has been tested in the Supreme Court and affirmed. There is no legal path to calling the monument wrong. So here is what you are actually looking at when you stand at the Four Corners Monument. You are looking at a marker placed in 1875 by a surveyor using 19th century instruments in the middle of a desert, working from a longitude system the country would abandon 37 years later. That marker is not perfectly aligned with modern GPS coordinates of the congressional intent. It sits roughly 1,800 feet from where pure math would put the intersection. And every single one of the 6 governments that converge at that point agrees it is exactly right. The Civil War drew the lines. A different longitude standard placed the marker. A Supreme Court ruling locked it in. 2 sovereign tribal nations manage the land around it. 6 governments have legal boundaries converging there, and most people just know it as the place where you put your hands in 4 states. The monument is legally correct, historically loaded, geologically remarkable, and politically layered in ways that take more than a quick visit to absorb. But the single strangest thing about it remains that the marker is in the right place precisely because we decided the marker makes the place right. That principle, the monument controls, not the math, is not just a legal technicality. It is a statement about how boundaries actually work in practice. They are not lines in space. They are agreements between parties, enforced by law, anchored by physical markers that humans placed in the ground. Every border in the United States operates under some version of that logic. The Four Corners Monument just makes it visible in a way that almost no other place does, because there it sits in the open desert with 4 state lines running through it and 1,000 years of human history underneath it. So the next time someone tells you the Four Corners Monument is in the wrong place, you can tell them the truth. By every measure that matters under U.S. law, the marker is exactly where it is supposed to be, and the math simply does not get a vote.